Could I move on with some questions to Dr. Simpson, please? Well, it's a very fascinating and detailed report you presented, based obviously on many years of work. I'd just like to pick up a couple of points. The historical detail you were given leading up to the previous to 30th September is very interesting, but I'd like to be clear where you are leading us with it. You referred frequently to US and UK officials who said they hoped that the PKI could be encouraged into launching an abortive coup, which would result in their own destruction. But can I confirm you are not suggesting that this is actually what happened? In other words, you're not suggesting there was any complicity behind the 30 September affair. Indeed, am I not correct that the US and the UK were taken completely by surprise by it?
That is correct. What I argue, and what I think the record shows, the evidentiary record shows, is that through their covert operations, this is the argument that I would make based on many years of studying virtually the entirety of the declassified record, is that the goal of US and British covert operations was to help create a climate of uncertainty and chaos inside of Indonesia that would encourage one party or another, the army or the PKI, to strike against its opponents. Most US officials thought that the army was unwilling to act proactively, and that therefore the only way in which they could be induced to strike against the PKI, which was the largest political movement in Indonesia at the time and was supported by the Indonesian president, was if the PKI acted rashly and acted first. And so we see repeated references by Western officials that the most hopeful outcome from their perspective would be if the PKI could be induced to strike first and therefore provide the army with the justification and the political legitimacy for destroying the party. This is not to say that the United States or Great Britain were directly involved in the events of September 30th at all. They were not. In fact, the US was taken very much by surprise, as was the United Kingdom. It is worth noting, however, that as soon as the events of September 30th unfolded, the US National Security Advisor asked the head of the CIA if he could state definitively to the press that the CIA was not involved in these events. And it took the CIA director some time to check around and confirm that he could indeed state this factually. Which is to say that the United States and Britain and other Western powers hoped that something like the September 30th movement would happen. They hoped that the PKI could be lured or through propaganda and other covert operations could be induced to striking first and providing the army with an excuse to crush it, which would have political legitimacy inside of Indonesia. At the time, the British ambassador Andrew Gilchrist said in one of the first reports sent to the British embassy or to the British Foreign Ministry in London after September 30th, he said, and I quote, "It has always been my opinion that a little shooting was necessary to resolve this situation. It is a pity that they have shot the wrong people first." And so there was a belief among most Western officials that the physical destruction of the PKI was necessary and that this would involve a great deal of violence. But in the context of 1965, the army itself was very reluctant to initiate such a campaign because they were worried of the political consequences. And the United States and Britain were very politically vulnerable. And so the extent of their assistance, covert and otherwise, for the army should not be taken to mean that they only supported the army a little. The degree of U.S. support was a reflection of the necessary degree of secrecy which American officials thought needed to be maintained in order to prevent the PKI from linking the United States and the Indonesian army. So their greatest fear was that covert operations would become publicly known and that Sukarno would be able to tie the Indonesian army to the forces of Nekolim, neocolonialism.
Right. Yes.
And this was something they wanted to avoid at all
Thank you very
costs.
much. I think you've answered that very helpfully. My second question is, you were asked by the prosecution, the second question really relates to my question to the prosecution about acts and omissions. You were asked what would have happened if the US and UK had opposed the killings. And in your answer, you focused on the difference which might have been made if the British had not exercised military restraint and if small arms had not been supplied. We've had evidence, of course, and there's plentiful evidence that one didn't need to have bullets in order to kill people. Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite sure how much weight one attaches to that second point. But I'm surprised in a way that you don't attach more weight to the difference it might have made if the UK and the US governments had publicly denounced or deplored the killings.
At the time, it is difficult to imagine that they would have deplored the killings, since they have been agitating for over a year to precisely that end. So making a case for the likely outcome had the US or Great Britain decided to denounce the killings is equivalent to asking what would have happened if the United States had decided to withdraw from Vietnam and to now allow the National Liberation Front to come to power. It is somewhat inconceivable that this would have happened.
I see.
We can say that the United States did not agree with the Indonesian army on everything, and could have used its influence to try and limit the killings in the interest of preventing other forms of social and political chaos which they saw as detrimental to U.S. interests, such as the unleashing of Islamicist movements which the U.S. as well as the Indonesian army were deeply concerned about. But the concern of the United States was never that too many people were being killed. I have read literally thousands of documents, probably 30,000 pages of US and British and Australian documents.
Right.
And I've yet to come across a single statement from any Western official that too many people were killed.
Okay, Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful again. No more questions, Mr. President.
Thank you. Colleagues from my extreme left.
No, it's okay.
And my right.
I have a few questions. Mr. Simpson, Dr. Simpson, you understand that every breath you used and every sentence you spoke contained propositions of interest, and particularly interest, as it were, on one side of this issue. You do understand that?
Could you please clarify?
Well, I mean, pretty well every sentence you said contained an interesting assertion for those who might hold views contrary to the behavior or adverse in inference to the conduct of America and the United Kingdom. You understand that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Each sentence, therefore, needs to be sourced, doesn't it?
Yes.
We haven't had the advantage in advance of your testimony of being able to check what it is, or even review what it is you're relying on. You understand that? And as a historian, you know that you have always, you as a historian have to look at both sides of an issue, or the many sides of any issue you're considering, don't you?
Of course I do.
And you'd accept that we as judges have to do the same thing.
Yes.
What would be the counter? We have no counter-narrative. What would be the counter-narrative that you as an academic would say we should look at?
Well, let me first say that there are a number of British and Australian historians who have written about this subject at great length, including the historian David Easter, who has written a full-length book and 3 or 4 articles concerning British covert operations and intelligence operations between 1963 and 1966. There's another British historian named John Subritsky who has written a book about the British confrontation with Indonesia over Malaysia, as well as another historian named Matthew Jones who has written a similar book on confrontasi. The historical record on the British side is extensively well documented because this was the largest British military campaign in Southeast Asia after the Second World War. And so it is a subject of great interest.
So my question is directed to, is there a counter-narrative?
Yes. Yeah.
And are these books that you've just spoken of, which I have to confess I knew nothing of in advance, are they likely to present a different view of events from yours?
I think there is an emerging scholarly consensus that both the British and the United States government, and secondarily the Australian government, as well as other governments, were deeply concerned about the leftward trajectory of Indonesia in 1964 and 1965. There is no debate at all that the US and Britain undertook these covert operations. There is no debate among historians as to their goal, nor is there debate as to the knowledge that they had of the events that were unfolding. The debate is really more among former officials who have criticized my work and the work of other historians for insufficiently appreciating the perceived danger that they felt emanating from Indonesia at the time and what they perceived to be the danger or risks of what would happen if the Communist Party were to come to power.
Can you identify so that we can at least contemplate considering them?
Sure.
One or two of these counter-narratives.
Sure. So Marshall Green, the U.S. ambassador to Indonesia at the time, has written a book called Crisis and Confrontation, in which he gives his perspective on the events of 1965 and 1966. The former U.S. political consul, Paul Gardner, has written a very lengthy book about U.S.-Indonesian relations in which he also discusses this at great length. And I think that certainly the position among ex-officials is that historians who criticize U.S. policy do not fully appreciate the political tenor of the times and the danger that many Americans saw in a possible PKI ascension to power or in the leftward tilt of Indonesia in the direction of communist China in 1965. But there's little debate on the facts of the matter because the documents that I cite in my presentation have all been published and widely published for a number of years now. The question of the provision of lists to the Indonesian army by the political consul Robert Martins and by the CIA station chief Hugh Tovar at the time has come under significant criticism from Martins and other staff who were working at the embassy, who claim that there was nothing nefarious or conspiratorial or that there were no ill intentions behind the provision of these lists. And Martins has suggested that this information was information that the Indonesian army already had in its possession. I have seen a number of documents from the U.S. Ambassador Marshall Green, whose account of these events differs quite substantially from my own, in which he himself laments the deplorable state of Indonesian army intelligence on the structure of the PKI and suggests that the army didn't have the capacity to identify regional and provincial leadership cadres without U.S. support.
Okay. You've said enough to make it clear that there are some counter-narratives that if we were to decide to deal with this issue at all, we should in some way consider.
Sure.
And let's now deal with one or two questions, only about two, I think, in detail. And I think I understand it, perhaps you'd help me. What was the underlying motivation? Was it just fear of communism? Or was it some other geopolitical interest, as they describe it? What was going on, really?
What was the underlying motivation for the United States and Great Britain?
As you described, UK and British involvement, yeah.
Yeah. The way that the British Embassy described the conflict in Indonesia at the time was as a battle for the commanding heights of the Indonesian economy between the army and the PKI. The British were deeply afraid that their economic interests in Indonesia were being threatened. And so locally they saw this as a question of which direction the Indonesian economy would be moving in, whether it would abandon private property rights and challenge the prerogatives of Western investors, with potentially grave consequences for US and British and Western capital more generally in other parts of the world. This was especially the case with regards to oil, where both British and American companies had far more substantial reserves in the Middle East and in Latin America than they did in Indonesia. And they were gravely concerned about the impact of Indonesian challenges to the position of Western corporations for their interests in other parts of the world. That said, the US in particular saw Indonesia as a grave threat to its regional interests. They saw it as more important than Vietnam. And once the PKI had been destroyed, the Central Intelligence Agency and other US officials argued that there really was no more reason to fight the Vietnam War because the largest domino in the region had already toppled in the direction of the United States. So there were certainly geopolitical reasons for the US and the British concern. The chief British concern was that Indonesia was waging a war against it to prevent the formation of Malaysia, and that the prosecution of this war was causing substantial budgetary problems for the British government at a time when it was hoping to begin reducing its presence in Southeast Asia and withdrawing its forces from the region entirely. This is withdrawing its forces from east of the Suez, something which Britain actually began doing in 1967. So from the British perspective, this was primarily a military and a geopolitical threat. From the American perspective, it was a geopolitical and something of an economic threat. And I believe that if we look at the broad picture, the US and other Western officials saw the Indonesian Communist Party as the chief obstacle, the chief mass-based obstacle to the reintegration of Indonesia into the regional political economy on Western terms, because the PKI could be expected to strenuously oppose the kinds of policies which the US had in fact proposed, for example, in 1962 and 1963 when it attempted to impose an IMF-style structural adjustment program on Indonesia, a program which provoked mass protests. The IMF came back to Indonesia in 1966 and imposed a very similar program, and there were no protests because there was no more PKI to oppose it.
I think I follow your line of argument, but you won't be surprised to know that with no document to look at, no report, no footnotes to consider, I opened up a few things on the internet when I had a question to ask, and I encountered something, not that I was particularly expecting, but I just like your view on it. It was that the Labour Foreign Secretary, Michael Stewart, to Harold Wilson's government, was reported apparently as saying that it's only the economic chaos of Indonesia which prevents that country from offering great potential opportunities to British exporters. If there's going to be a deal with Indonesia, as I hope one day there may be, I think we ought to take an active part and try to secure a slice of the cake ourselves. Now, the commentator, whoever it is, I don't know, it's the internet, so I can't tell.
I've actually cited the same document in my book. So.
And that's part of the underlying policy of the British.
This was the underlying policy of each of the Western governments who, after 1966, hoped to secure a place for foreign investors in a post-Sukarno Indonesia. Once a new foreign investment law was passed, there was a great scuffle breaking out among Western companies, mainly in the extractive sector, mining, forestry, oil extraction, and the like, to get concession agreements in Indonesia. And British petroleum companies in particular were hoping to get new concession agreements because many of their existing concessions were running out of oil. So it was not surprising that these companies were anxious for a government to come to power which would welcome the return of Western investors. And in fact, the regime made it quite clear in its appeals to foreign investors in 1966 and 1967 that labor laws were being passed which would prevent labor organizing and activism and the like.
I must take almost no more time, so therefore 2 very short questions. Have any of the political leaders in either America or the United Kingdom or even Australia on this topic written recanting documents of any kind?
No.
And the last question, which may not be your area, but were you here yesterday?
Yes.
Did you hear questions about the way that people were dehumanized so that killings could happen? Now, that may not be your area, but you tell us you've read so much material. Is there anything you'd like to offer in relation to that? In particular, is there anything that you can tell us about the knowledge of the Western powers, as you would say, bringing about these killings that show they knew what was going to happen and how?
I don't argue that they knew what was going to happen. I do argue that US and British propaganda aimed to amplify and in some cases contribute to the Army's own efforts to demonize the PKI and therefore publicly and politically legitimize its destruction. In fact, this was the aim, one of the crucial aims of British and American covert operations. The documents do not say we hope to legitimize a genocide or engage in dehumanization. These are not genocide scholars using terms that scholars would use. But they very explicitly called for the use of propaganda to justify the political destruction of the PKI and to use and amplify the themes that the Army itself was using by reporting the Army's claims about the castration of the generals and the like, reporting them as fact, distributing this information to Western journalists, broadcasting it from clandestine radio stations, giving media guidances to the Voice of America, the Australian Broadcasting Company, and other state-owned broadcasting companies, so as to amplify the Indonesian Army's own propaganda themes related to the dehumanization of the PKI, so that Indonesians would be reading the same information coming from the foreign press that they were hearing, and hearing from foreign radio that they were hearing from Berita Yuta, the Army-controlled newspaper.
All right, thanks very much.
All right. I believe that Judge Van France has a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have one question. During your research, do you get some information the IMF was involved in a way or in another way?
The IMF had no involvement in either the September 30th movement or the killings that followed. The IMF had been negotiating with Indonesia to restructure its debt in the early 1960s, and with the support of the US and the British government, attempted to secure the agreement from Sukarno of a very politically unpopular stabilization program, which the Indonesian government then abandoned in the face of popular protest. In late 1966, the IMF began renegotiating with Indonesia for a rescheduling of its debt payments and for IMF assistance in helping to stabilize its currency. And the US and other Western governments made very clear that they expected the Indonesian government to undertake dramatic and far-reaching structural reforms of the economy in order to gain access to these funds, which the United States, as the largest creditor nation in the IMF, was in a very good position to demand. And so the IMF assistance came well after the regime was starting to consolidate its power, and as the international community was beginning to organize a large-scale rescue and rehabilitation operation to begin ensuring that the new Suharto government would have the necessary economic and political stability to consolidate its power and achieve some measure of political legitimacy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your evidence, and you've given it.